joining us on your Thursday afternoon or perhaps evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. I'm going to start a little bit by introducing myself. I am the manager of outreach and community engagement with WINGS. I have been involved in this field of domestic and sexual violence for a little over a decade now, and have been with WINGS working specifically with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse in an outreach role for 1 year. So I feel very excited to talk to you about this today, and I also want to get a feel for who we have on the call. So I think Josh has a poll that he's going to provide. If you could just let me know your general field that you are from, and if you do not fit into one of the fields that the options are, please feel free to type that into the comment box. I would just love to know where everyone is coming from today. Additionally, after you let me know what field you're in, I also want to know what you are hoping to get out of today's poll. So, or not today's poll, I'm sorry, out of today's presentation. So if you had something specific beyond the kind of how do I support an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse, if you had something really specific that you were hoping I would touch on or that you would like me to touch on, please feel free to type that into the comment box now or at any time. And I apologize, I thought I turned these off, guys. So if they pop up again, I'm sorry, I tried to turn them off. But if you would at any time share that, and then at the end of the presentation, we will check in and see if I answered your question, what you were hoping to learn. And if not, we can touch on those together. So, okay, let's look at the poll. Okay, so I am not seeing the poll results on my computer. Oh no.
Okay. So I will read them out for you. We have 74% chiming in as advocates, 10% as mental health clinicians, 16% being other, and what I've gotten through the chat box is a support specialist on the National Sexual Assault Hotline, family law attorney from Virginia. And that's all the responses I have in terms of people's job descriptions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Josh, for sharing that, and thank you everyone for participating. So a lot of advocates on the line, which I would have expected since we have that as part of our title of the presentation, but I've done this before, and we've had folks from other parts of the field in different positions. So I'm really glad to hear that some of you are with us today too, and I hope that the information that I share is going to be applicable for everyone. So I know we're all coming from different stages of what we do here, and so I do want to let you know that some things I will breeze over, other things I might explain in a little more depth. If there's anything that I do not touch on like you would like me to, please pop into the comment box and say, hey, what was that acronym, or could you explain more on this? Josh is going to try to keep in touch with me as those questions come through, but otherwise I've got 2 spots in the presentation where we'll stop and ask questions. And I'm going to start with a couple of statistics. So the last CDC numbers that we got are that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are survivors of childhood sexual abuse, or are victims of childhood sexual abuse, whatever language you'd like to use there. That means that we have people on the call today who are going to identify as survivors. So I do hope to honor your experience, and at the end, if there's anything that you would like to share with us all, or if you'd like to get in touch with me in particular to let me know some of your thoughts, please feel free to do that. So with 1 in 5 people, which is how we like to look at this, 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys, 90% of those kiddos are victimized by someone they know, and 30 to 60% of them, it's a member of their own family. So lots of people are experiencing this, and in very complex ways. So if we look at those 1 in 5 kids, the other thing that we like to look at here at WINGS, where we work with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, is the 9 and 10 who don't report. So what we also know, the statistic about 1 in 10 victims who do report the abuse, who do receive help. And those are two separate things, because there are some kids and some adults who make that effort to say something to get help, and they get rebuked or denied or shamed. And then, as a lot of us who do this work know, they may not come back and get the help. So those people who never get the help, those 9 in 10, that's what we're looking at today. And so why is it necessary to look specifically at adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, those people who didn't receive the help that they needed? There are so many impacts that will follow that child through their childhood into adulthood and really interfere with the rest of their life. So talking about some psychological impacts here, there's the guilt, shame. I think we see these in a lot of people who have experienced trauma, especially relational trauma. The self-blame that comes from that experience, sexuality issues. A survivor who I worked with talked about how his first victimization was at 4 years old. And at 4 years old, he had been learning about boys and girls, and he understood some of the differences between boys and girls, mainly with genitalia. And he remembers thinking to himself, well, why did this happen to me? You know, I thought I was a boy, but maybe I'm supposed to be a girl. Maybe that's why this happened to me. And then as he got a little bit older, 6 or 7, he said, well, you know, I know I am a boy, you know, I'm supposed to be a boy, but maybe this person thinks that, you know, I'm a girl. So, and then later in his life, when he was an adolescent, thinking, okay, I'm a boy, I know I'm a boy, this person knows I'm a boy, but maybe I'm gay. And so just trying to figure out at the different ages and stages in his own developmental state and knowing what he knew, what does this mean? What does this mean when this other person does something to me that I don't understand to be appropriate? Addictions and eating disorders are also very common coping mechanisms that adult survivors will turn to. Of course, mental situations like post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative identity disorder, or other dissociative disorders are also very common. Having difficulty regulating their own emotions, and then of course depression and risk of suicide are going to be very high with folks who have experienced this level of trauma as well. So then we go on to some physical impacts that one might experience as an adult survivor. A lot of chronic medical conditions, including migraines, gastrointestinal disorders, fibromyalgia, and any kind of throat and mouth problems. So these are some of the more common ones, although of course there are others. And here I also like to share a story about Marilyn Vanderbeer. She is a Colorado native, and she was Miss America in the 1950s. And she was one of the first people to come and speak out about her child sexual abuse from her father in the 1980s. And one of the things that Marilyn talks about is her gastrointestinal disorders that she suffered with for years. Because when she was young, from the ages 5 to 18, her father was coming in and sexually abusing her at night. And she would tighten her body, she'd get into the fetal position and just scrunch herself up so tightly, as tight as she could, because she was making every effort to keep her father away from her, from being able to abuse her. And essentially, she trained her body for those 13 years to tighten up. And so when she was older and she was safe and she felt safe, her body then said, hey, you need help. And it reacted in such a way that she had really severe gastrointestinal disorders because of all of that tightening that she had done for years and years. So then we go on to relational impacts. I think most of us here can understand that when this kind of trauma happens in a relationship, especially if it's a loved one, a trusted person, is going to have relational impacts on how they then go on to form and maintain relationships. So attachment disorders, any kind of parenting challenges, unhealthy boundaries with others, and then ongoing peer and intimate relationship struggles. These are all very common things that adult survivors will deal with. Another thing that we know is that victims of childhood sexual abuse are 2 to 3 times more likely to be re-victimized by intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault. So those of you on the lines who work in the domestic or sexual violence field or work with victims, survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I know I did for a long time. You're hearing of this overlap, you know. I've been sexually assaulted by someone I knew. I'm also currently in a domestic violence relationship, and this stuff has been happening to me since I was a child. So there's a lot of that overlap there because of the trauma, because of the breaking down of healthy norms and boundaries. Additionally, adult survivors are more likely to have multiple sexual partners, increased exposure to STDs, unplanned pregnancies, and reproductive health issues. And as with anyone with trauma, one person's reaction is not necessarily going to be like another person's reaction. Everyone has their own different ways of coping and dealing with things. But for these sexual things, the reactions can really be anywhere on the scale, and it does vary from person to person, because you might have someone who takes control of their sexuality by initiating sex. Maybe they don't want it, maybe they don't feel safe, but they still have the control. And so that might be why they have multiple sexual partners or don't feel like they feel safe to ask the other person to use protection or anything like that, because still the way they're organizing it gives them that sense of control. And then of course on the other end of the scale, you're going to have people who abstain completely, who do not feel safe being sexual with someone else. So a couple of common experiences that survivors, especially those that we work with here at Wings, that we see quite frequently, are that they have trouble connecting what happened to them as a child to what's happening now. They don't necessarily understand that the relationship struggles, that the fibromyalgia, the depression, they may not put those together with, oh, maybe this all started when I was 4 years old and uncle started abusing me. They just know something's wrong, or they might think something's wrong with me. I need to get help, but they don't necessarily know what it is or how. They may or may not have memories of the abuse. It's really common for folks who've experienced trauma, and especially children with their developing brains, for their brains to protect them by dividing up what's safe and what's not safe. To reference Marilyn Van de Beer one more time, she talks about her day child and her night child, and how her night child took the abuse and kept that experience from the day child, so that that day child could go to school, could be successful, could function. And it allowed her to feel like she was living a normal life. And so that's one level of dissociation. And as I mentioned earlier with DID, with dissociative identity disorder and dissociation disorders, there's quite a lot that can fall on that spectrum, but it's not uncommon at all for those memories to be locked away or be in a place where they're not easily accessible, or they come back to someone in pieces and fragments. They may not be able to put it all together, but that is something that's common with folks who've experienced trauma, and especially sexual trauma at a young age. Many survivors have trouble considering that what even happened to them was sexual abuse. So the words that we use, the ways that we name things, there's a survivor who I worked with who just called what happened to him it. He didn't call it rape, he didn't call it abuse, it was just it. And if what happened to you was just it, how do you know how to get help for it? How do you know if there is help for it? What does that look like? So again, knowing where to go. First of all, being able to pull up the courage to even ask for help. And then if you do want to ask for help, where do you go? Oh, sorry guys, thought I had one more there. Where do you go for help? If you're a male, do you feel safe going to the local rape crisis center, especially if it's called a rape crisis center or a sexual assault center? So going back to that, how do we describe it, and how do we promote ourselves in the community? How do we talk about what we do with others? Do we make ourselves accessible to people who may not consider themselves to have experienced incest, or to have been raped, or to have been sexually abused? So what does that mean with how we're talking to people and advertising ourselves if they don't necessarily fit into the boxes that we draw for them? Okay, so of course there's also going to be a lot of those common barriers that we deal with a lot of survivors of all kinds of trauma. The silence around the issue, Fortunately, we've started talking more about these things. We've been talking about domestic violence more over the last decade, talking about sexual assault more, especially sexual assault on college campuses these last few years. And of course, with the Me Too movement, that has really raised a lot of conversation as well. But I would argue that we're still not talking about childhood sexual abuse in a lot of places. So that silence still remains, and the stigma over that being someone's life, their story, the neighbor that violated them, or the father, or the babysitter. So that stigma of being able to even admit it, talk about it, and feel safe talking about it is still there. The victim blaming that, of course, we see with adults and with children, people not wanting to accept that someone else has behaved in this way. The denial of the situation, making it easier to cope with and function if you just ignore it and let it go, and that's by survivors and loved ones and community members alike. And then, of course, with the intrafamilial abuse, the complexities that are in addition to all of these other things that we've talked about when it is someone who lives in the home, who's connected with the family. Not only does that have a whole nother layer of complexities with how the child feels, how it's affected on them when it's someone within the family, but also what does that mean to get help? A lot of children are met with, you're going to ruin the family. We need dad here. He provides for us. Or how could you do that? We're all a family. We want to stay together. Why would you say that about someone? There's a lot of things that come into that being able to get help or even feel like help is available or an option for them when it's someone within the family. So when do adult survivors commonly seek help? So a few of the things that we see are if the perpetrator passes or the non-offending parent. So the safety of not having that person anymore to hurt them or to quote unquote ruin the family, just that general feeling of safety that now they can talk about it. The birth of a child or a child reaching the age that the survivor was when they were abused. For female survivors, the birthing process alone can be very triggering, can bring back memories, thoughts, things that would cause them to feel like, okay, this is a problem and I need to reach out, especially starting on that parenting path with a new child. And then also seeing a child turn 5 or 9 or 14 and kind of being faced with that out-of-body experience. When I think about me and what happened to me, I can kind of set it aside, dissociate from it, think about it a little differently. But when I see that little child, my child, and see how small and vulnerable and innocent they are, and think about what happened to me happening to them, it's a whole different way to kind of think about that. So that can be very triggering for parents as well to have that moment. If their own child is abused or, heaven forbid, becomes a perpetrator, both of those things can be very triggering for survivors as well. The breakup of an intimate relationship. As I mentioned earlier, I've heard from several survivors say, I just couldn't hold a relationship. We'd get close and then pull away. I just couldn't let them do that, but I wanted it to happen. I just felt like something was wrong with me and I didn't know what it was, but I needed help. And again, they didn't necessarily make that connection to their root trauma in childhood, but having that happen, losing someone you really cared about or losing someone over and over again can be a trigger for someone to say, I need to go get help. If another assault occurs as an adult, that can be another trigger for someone to say, I need help, but I need help, for everything. So I know a lot of you SA advocates out there have probably been talking with someone who was recently assaulted, and that's why they're seeking your services. But when you talk with them, it's revealed that there's been a lot more going on than just this recent assault. And of course, all of us who are in the helping agencies know that if someone close to them discloses, all of us who are out there doing the work, and the same thing for survivors, if they're talking about it, if they're sharing, sometimes that allows someone else to feel safe that they can share too. So that can be another reason why someone might say, okay, this isn't just me, I want to get some help for this. So how does that present then? As I'm sure you're already putting the pieces together, it's when they're coming and receiving help, but it's not necessarily for their CSA. Sometimes that does happen and someone says, I had this happen in childhood, it is plaguing me, I need help. That is not unheard of. But more often than not, it's because they've had a recent sexual assault and they're going to an SA agency, going to a child advocacy center because their child's been recently assaulted, or perhaps this is their encounter with the police because their child's been assaulted and law enforcement responds. And then however that works in your community, whether it's the advocates at the police station, whether they connect them with the community agency, they say, hey, this happened to me too when I was their age. If there's a intimate partner violence or domestic violence situation, as I mentioned earlier, I was a BV advocate for 7 years, and I worked with people who were obviously there because they were in a recent domestic violence situation and trying to seek help for that. But through our conversation, as we talked and did peer counseling and safety planning, and just kind of got to know each other, it would often come out that they had experienced abuse as a child, whether it was sexual or otherwise, but that they had in some way or another been dealing with this type of unhealthy relationship for their whole lives. Any kind of mental health concerns, so showing up at the local community mental health center or getting a private counselor because they want to deal with their mental health because they're struggling and they know they're struggling with that. Any kind of relationship concerns, as we've already talked about, so that's probably showing up in a mental health clinician's office as well. Any kinds of addictions or medical concerns, which we touched on. So again, a lot of different ways that trauma can impact someone and present. And so that's why I'm glad we have so many folks on the line from different places, because we know that these people are seeking help for a lot of different things, and it's often connected to that root trauma, but that root trauma of CSA is not usually their reason for seeking help, at least not something that they've identified as their reason for seeking help. So some common fears and barriers among providers, but also loved ones and community members, why you or they may not feel comfortable talking about childhood sexual abuse with an adult survivor, may not feel comfortable asking questions or continuing that conversation. It's because one may not have an understanding of the issue. So I don't necessarily want to go down a road that I don't understand because I'm not going to be the most helpful. So that's really common. Additionally, just not knowing the resources, like I can talk to you about this, I can provide you support and comfort, but I don't know what to tell you. So that can be another reason as well. And then also just feeling like you don't know how to respond. Maybe this is just such unfamiliar ground for someone that they are just triggered, like, okay, something's going on here. I don't know what it is, but I'm just going to move on to the next subject because that's more comfortable for me. So all of these things are common and nothing to be ashamed of. It is just a reason to learn more so that you can have that comfort and feel more prepared for when this happens again. Okay, so Josh is going to conduct some more polls for me, please. And Josh, if you'd also share them since I'm not seeing them on my screen. But I'm going to ask a couple questions here, starting with who on the line has experienced a CSA disclosure before? So whether it was in your professional life, whether it was in your personal life, who here has had someone either come out and say to them, you know, this happened to me as a child, or maybe through your work, you heard some signals and you asked questions and they said, yes, that's what happened to me. However it came out, if you've had someone disclose to you, I'd like to know that. Josh, do you have the poll answers in yet?
Yes, I do. 92% saying yes, 6% saying no, and 3% saying I don't know.
Okay, all right, well, great. So a lot of you are probably here today because of how that went. So that's my next question is, for those of you that had this happen to you, which is most of us on the line, how was that for you? Did you find it difficult? Did you feel like you did have the tools and resources that you needed? Or was it somewhere in between? And so just kind of think back to that moment, or if it's happened to you more than one time, were they similar experiences? I know you can't say like, well, for this experience it was this and for this experience it was that, but do your best to kind of just assess, how did you feel? How was it for you to be a part of that, and especially if you were acting as a support person in some way, how did that feel for you? So do we have the answers in for that one yet, Josh?
Yes, 23% saying easy, 69% saying okay, and 9% saying difficult.
Okay, thank you for that, Josh, and for everybody. Yeah, that's kind of about what I expected. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I know we're all in different areas of our professions. Maybe some of us are newer, some of us have been doing it for a while. But we've all had different levels of training and experience. You know, you might have been doing your job for 8 years and then finally had someone disclose to you, and it's going to be different. So hearing that the bulk of you are kind of in that middle section where maybe you felt like you had something to offer but not quite what you wanted is about what I would expect from most folks, and why you're probably here with me today. So thank you for sharing that. I also want to ask you, in that moment, in those times where you were being that person, what were you able to offer? Was it, I think that Josh set this up so that you can select as many as are applicable. So did you feel like you had the resources to offer them? Did you feel like you were just offering support or validation? Go ahead and click as many of those as you felt like you had at the time, and let us know. This will kind of help me understand where we're lacking and what we would like to learn a little bit more about. So Josh, do we have those?
Yes, we have 97% selecting validation and comfort, 94% support in the moment, 56% ongoing support, 74% resources, and 76% referrals.
Okay, great. Those are actually some really wonderful numbers. It sounds like we're lacking in a couple of places. For instance, the ongoing support, I know that that is dependent on your job. Some of you are able to offer that ongoing support, whether it was a loved one and someone in your life and you kept that relationship, whether you are an advocate who's able to work with people as long as you would like or they need to. And other people have more time limited experiences. So perhaps you would have liked to offer ongoing support but couldn't. So I do understand that difference. But for the other things that we asked about there, it sounds like for the most part, you guys are feeling pretty good. Maybe just here and there, a couple extra pieces would be helpful. So the last question that I'm asking is, what would have been helpful to be better able to help someone? And I believe that this is a comment box question. So if there's anything that in particular, especially with like the question, what were you able to offer? If there's something that you would have liked to be able to offer, but you didn't know how, or maybe you're in a rural community and you just don't have the resources that you'd like to have, go ahead and type that into the comment box. And we'll ask Josh to share those back with us here in just a second. So I'm going to come back to this question in just a moment to give you guys all time to comment in the box. And I'm going to go to this next slide for just a moment. So if you're sitting with someone and talking with them, excuse me, about their experience, whatever it is they presented to you for, what might you see to put up a red flag that maybe there's some trauma there, trauma that could be childhood sexual abuse, but again, not necessarily, but just something to kind of be aware of. So anyone who has a normalization or unhealthy or abusive behavior of unhealthy or abusive behaviors, I think a lot of us, especially who've worked in the DV world, have seen this, where it's like, as a DV example, you know, well, this guy's just, you know, he's kind of mean to me. He yells at me. He calls me names. He's kind of controlling. But the last guy I was with, he threw me down the stairs. So it's a lot better now. So those kinds of minimization of what's happening, that normalization of unhealthy or abusive behaviors, we see that in adult survivors of trauma or CSA as well, and any kind of trauma survivor. Someone who has an automatic lack of trust for others, just that's how it is for everybody, and you have to work real hard to break through that barrier. That's a clue to look into some kind of trauma. Any kind of unhealthy boundaries, and again, this could be a whole scale of things, but just not having had that modeled for them in a way that they're able to replicate. Any kind of unhealthy coping mechanisms, addictions, and eating disorders. So if you're working with someone and see any of those kind of clues, again, it doesn't mean anything in particular, but just might want to take a closer look. And if someone says something along the lines of, this isn't new for me, things like this have happened to me before, I didn't feel like I could say no, I felt like I had no voice in the situation. I felt like I had no power in what happened to me. And this one is a bit on, but when I was their age, this happened to me. That's pretty obvious. But a lot of these kind of things, if you hear someone saying that, they're either telling you very directly or they're trying to clue you in that this is, you know, I've been experiencing this before. And so asking more questions. Is it just more abusive relationships that you've been in before this? Has this happened since your childhood? What does that mean? Okay, so I want to pause now and go back to the question of what would have been helpful to know to be better able to help the survivor, and check with Josh to see what you guys were needing.
So we didn't have anybody type into the chat box, but we did have selectable answers. So 3% said more about child sexual abuse, 6% more about trauma and its impacts, 47% more about CSA trauma's impact on adult survivors, and 44% more about resources for adult survivors of CSA.
Great. Well, here I am not remembering how we put things together. So thank you all for doing what was in front of you, and thank you, Josh, for translating. Of course, if you have anything specific, feel free to put that in the comment box, but that was actually a really helpful question the way we designed it. So yeah, it sounds like there's kind of a mix of things. And I heard resources as being a big one. So we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a minute, but thank you for sharing that with me, because that definitely helps us figure out where we can help you a little bit more. So a few things that you can say to someone who discloses that they are an adult survivor is, that shouldn't have happened. It wasn't okay. Your experience is not uncommon. I can't tell you how many survivors I've talked with who felt like they were the only one. Like this was happening to them and no one else knew about it. No one else knew what it was like. And that realization that it happens not just to other people, but to lots of other people can actually be very powerful. Sometimes the things that happen to us in childhood are connected to what you were just talking about. So that can be a bridge between, if they have a more recent experience, what they're presenting to you with, and if this comes up, is trying to help them make that connection. There is help. Would you like some options? Would you like me to give you some things or help you find some things? I've also talked to several survivors who said that a lot of people heard their stories and were very apologetic, were very sad for them, but the piece that was missing was that action step of, can I help you get what you need? And they don't always know what they need. So saying something like, there is help out there, you know, I don't know what your local community resources are, but you probably have something, whether it's sexual assault agencies, whether it's community mental health centers, some people you do pro bono private practice with. There's going to be something, even if it's Skyping with a therapist who lives somewhere else. So helping point that out to them, that there is help, they're not alone, and helping connect them with those options can, again, be just very life-changing for someone, for you to actually step in and help them. But of course, not being a crutch, working with them as opposed to for them. You're not alone and I'm here for you. That's another one. And what can I do to support you while you go through this process? So again, I know this one is limited in some ways by people's position and what you're allowed to do, what kind of contact. But if you're not the person who can stay with them, who can do follow-up calls, who can check in and meet with them, who can be with them as they go through the healing process, then is there someone who can? Is there someone you can refer them to, do a warm handoff with, who can be there for them? Or do they have a loved one or family member? But if you're not the person, trying to find someone else who can be, and making that connection, making it happen so that they're not alone, so that they don't feel like they're doing this all by themselves. And just generally validating them and their experience and providing choices. What we say at Wings all the time is voice and choice, and both of those things are incredibly important for adult survivors of CSA. Okay, so a little bit about the approach to disclosure. I know we have a lot of advocates on the line, and the rest of you who are here, I know you're also helping professionals, so some of this is old hat, but I think a good reminder. So believe them, validate their experience without judgment or blame. acknowledge that the abuse was not their fault, nor any symptoms that they struggle with because of it. Another thing that I've heard said before many times is that the abuse is not something they are responsible for, but healing from the abuse is. And that is something that could be used over multiple different types of trauma, and not just CSA, is that we are responsible for our own healing. Assess the range of services available to them. Not only what they're presenting with, but now that you know that CSA is a factor as well. So what resources can you offer for the various needs that they have, and also prioritizing those needs. If they're coming in because of a recent sexual assault, although it's incredibly important to acknowledge that the childhood sexual abuse is also important and valid and not okay, and those things we just talked about, it may be something to touch on and then say, okay, I know you're trying to deal with this crisis right now. You may want to talk about what happened to you as a child in therapy or later on when you're feeling safe. But right now, let's deal with this, because I know that's what you came in today. Or giving them the option, you know, do you want to deal with this right now, or do you want to deal with what you came in for today? And if they're in a domestic violence situation, it is always imperative to make sure that they are safe before being able to do the healing work of their childhood sexual abuse. It's not even going to be worth their time to try to deal with that if they're in an unsafe situation at home. So prioritizing and just being aware. Affirm to them that healing is possible. They are not going to be like this forever. They can do the healing work and they can become whole again. It's not necessarily going to mean that what happened to them is going to go away, that they're going to forget it. I don't know anyone who's had that experience, but I know a lot of people who can function, who feel whole, who can enjoy their lives. So letting them know that that's possible and just helping connect them to the support and the resources that they will need to do that. And then of course, supporting and empowering them to seek that help when they're ready. So now they know that there is help and that they can heal, but when they're ready. And then honoring that choice. I know a lot of you are already doing that. Giving them choices and honoring what feels right. One of our survivors talks about how someone in Florida gave her our information about wings, and we're only available in Colorado, although we do talk to folks from out of state and sometimes out of country and do our best to help them. But she held on to that information for 5 years. And then when she moved to Colorado, she was able to access our services. But you just never know when you give someone information, when that information is going to be helpful to them. But providing that and then letting them make that choice is really important. Okay, so we're going to stop here real quick before I move into the next section, and I'm going to check in with Josh. Josh, do we have any questions? Has anything come in that I should touch on?
So one at the beginning, when you were asking what people are looking for inside of the presentation, and that is supportive exercises,
Great.
Assessments, or interventions I can use for working with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. But that's it so far.
Exercises, assessments, or interventions?
Correct.
Okay. Let's see, I'm thinking that may be a little deeper than we're going in this webinar today. I do appreciate that comment. And what I would ask of the person who wrote it is my information is going to be at the end, and I would really love for you to connect with me outside of the webinar and we can talk about that. So I would love to get you some information, but it's not going to be in today's presentation. And anyone else who feels the same way, go ahead and get in touch with me. All right, so thank you. Now I'm going to move into the next.
Just had one roll in. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, great. No problem.
Is there an age range that identifies childhood sexual abuse? Is the question.
Okay, yeah, great question. So at Wings, which is what I'm going to talk about next, we consider childhood anything under 18 and adulthood anything over 18. And when it comes to sexual violation, it is anything in a sexual nature or manner that makes someone feel violated or uncomfortable. So we are not talking about just rape or incest. It can also be, you know, someone an adult or an older child who exposes themselves to a child or has some sexually graphic language that makes them feel violated. So here at Wings, our definition is very broad. I know that's going to vary sometimes for other agencies. So I hope that answers that question. And so this next section is going to talk about Wings, the agency that I work for. I do not talk about this in an intent to turn the presentation toward an advertisement for our agency. However, our focus here at Wings is specifically to work with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse to help them on their healing. And I know that about half or so of our audience is in Colorado, about half of you are out of state. I talk about Wings today because we are a referral source, not just for people to use our services, but for us to be in this field of childhood sexual abuse survivors specifically and help them find the services that they need, whether it's from us or not. So I am going to talk a little bit about this just so that everyone has a good idea about what we do, so that if you have someone that you're working with who could benefit from giving us a call, that you know what that looks like. Okay, so our mission is to break the cycle and heal the wounds of childhood sexual abuse by providing education, advocacy, and support to adult survivors, loved ones, providers, and communities. We believe that qualified therapy plus support groups equal results. We've been around for 36 years and have made the mistake of just putting people right into group because they wanted to, and it's been detrimental to some people's healing, not just the person in group, but the other group members. So we now make sure that make sure that folks are ready for group and that they have an individualized therapist, because in our groups, we do not talk about the trauma. We do not go back on that story. We talk more about what's happening today. So one of the things we do not provide therapy at Wings, but we do have a list of therapists across the state of Colorado who work with trauma specifically and with childhood sexual abuse. And we vet these therapists. And so if someone is looking for therapy or also for community resources, if they're wanting to connect with their local sexual assault or domestic violence agency. We also have a lot of healers, alternative healers on our list as well. So if someone's looking for some healing, but not necessarily therapy, they can call us at Wings and we can connect them with some options for whatever else in the community that we may not provide that is still applicable to their healing work. The main service that we provide at Wings are our support groups. So we have groups for men, women, people who identify as LGBTQIA, folks of all genders, and then we also have loved ones groups as well. Our groups are therapist facilitated, but peer-led. They're in confidential locations across the Front Range of Colorado. They are donation-based and 2 hours a week. Those are our standard groups. We also have specialty groups, like an animal-assisted therapy group, trauma-informed yoga, expressive arts, writing groups, and one called Speak Out, where survivors go through an 8-week workshop to tell their story in a public space. The goals for Wings support groups are to increase knowledge and awareness of childhood sexual abuse symptoms and how they are present in their own life today, to reduce shame, reduce isolation, promote empowerment, and model healthy relationships. So I told you I would just talk a little bit about Wings, and that is pretty much it. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that we are doing a survey. We have already done phase 1, which was survivor feedback. Now we are wanting feedback from providers. So if you are in the state of Colorado and working in any of these fields where you would have victims of crime coming to your through your doors, we would love to connect with you on this survey, and Josh is going to send out information about it in the follow-up email, but you can also connect with me. So I know that this last piece talking about Wings has been really Colorado specific, but for those of you out of state, please do not hesitate to call us if you do have a survivor and don't know where to help them turn to, or if you just want to know more about what we do and how you can make that happen in your own state. We are very open to talking about both of those things and helping survivors wherever they are. So please do not feel like we cannot be of assistance to you if you are out of state. Any additional questions, any thoughts that have come up?
We just had one roll in that says, what does it mean to have a therapist, facilitated but peer-led support group?
Yes, so that's a great question. Our WINGS model makes sure that we have clinicians, master's level clinicians who co-facilitate each of our support groups. So they are not therapy groups, they are not process groups, they are peer-led support groups. But the therapists, and it's a very interesting role that we ask our co-facilitators to play because they are therapists, they do have the education and the experience, but when they're in group, they do not wear their therapist hat. They're there to create safety and structure. And if something were to come up, like they notice that someone might be dissociating or triggered, then they have the tools to be able to recognize that and either help that person or encourage them to get help from their therapist or whoever it might be, go home and talk to a loved one. But they are not actually conducting therapy or any group member's therapist. So I hope that answers the question. Any other questions or thoughts?
The person said, yes, that's helpful, thank you, but I have not seen any other questions roll through yet.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here today. I really do appreciate that. If you have any other thoughts or questions or would like to connect with me outside the webinar to talk more about how this information applies to your own position or department, in-state or out-of-state, please do feel free to get in touch. I would be more than happy to talk with you about whatever's going on, and if we don't have a ready answer for you here at WINGS, then we can work together to create one.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa, for all of that great information. And thanks once again to everybody who joined us today. I just want to mention before we all move on with our work today, that we will have another CSA webinar happening next month on the 18th that is going to be looking at trauma and the body. So please look out for the registration announcements regarding that. The announcements will start at the beginning of next month, and then also look out for the follow-up email that'll have the PDF version of the PowerPoint, a handout from Melissa, and then also language and the link for that One Voice project survey that she discussed. Anything else you'd like to share before we end today, Melissa?
No, I think I covered it all, but again, thank you so much for everyone being here today and also for participating. Really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Hope everybody has a great day. Take care.
Thanks.